Hello, welcome to part two of secondary online classroom management. I'm Mark Halbig. I'm a behavior support specialist with Albuquerque Public Schools. And what I want to do is remind us of what we did in part one. So in part one, we looked at some different features of Google Meet and its limits. We talked about establishing relationships online and the importance of social and emotional learning, not just during this time period, but anytime we're teaching in class, we need to have this as a focus. Establishing meeting expectations and providing a structure. Today, for part two, we're going to look at how to reinforce the behavior and building a gradual system of response. Times where we may need to address behaviors outside of the meeting, and then we'll look at some serious scenarios that have been seen around the district. So I want to show this page as a quick reminder, and remember the main focus of this was basically forgiving ourselves for this last 2 months, any shortcomings we may feel, not beating up ourselves, and using this more as a reflection piece of keeping in context the situation we've been going through, the limits that have been placed at teachers and students, the major learning curve, the lack of time. And so just making this more of a learning mindset than kind of beating ourselves up. So let's talk about the behaviors. Okay, so we talked about the importance of relationships and structure and expectations, but during the meeting, how do you reinforce those expectations you set? So one thing is to pre-correct as much as we can. And so this means before the behavior even starts, we can review the expectations at the beginning of class. We can set up individual meetings with students. So for example, maybe 15, 20 minutes before a session, I meet with one or two students who've been having issues, just as a reminder, see how they're doing, work on that relationship building, remind them of the expectations. Just hopefully that makes a difference once they're in front of everyone. We give verbal reminders. So for example, you could say, class, yesterday we had some troubles staying muted. Please make sure microphones are muted now. Remind them of those expectations. Please keep them muted during the 15 minutes of lesson. So pre-correct is a big way to reinforce your expectations. Specific praise. So this is where you don't just say good job, but you acknowledge the student, a group, the whole class, specific name there, and you acknowledge a specific behavior. So if they're doing a good job at keeping the microphones muted, you point that out specifically. And you can see the example there, okay? If you see the chat and you're looking at some questions, you could say, I want to thank everybody. The whole group is doing a nice job on keeping their questions academic related. So if there is one person who's asking stuff unrelated, maybe by reinforcing the whole group for the positive, that can sometimes just remind that person and get them to follow more of the rest of the group. Also, when we give a verbal reminder, put it in that context of what we want them to do, corrective reinforcement. So you can see the example there. Please remember to use chat for academic questions during the presentation, not just stop asking those questions in chat. Instead, we're reinforcing what we do want to see. And one thing we'll talk about later is how we can tie all this into our gradual system of escalating behavior. Incentives. Incentives are definitely more difficult in the online setting than they're going to be in classroom. So this might be something where students their input can help come up with some possible ideas. But remember, we want to try and keep positive communication on a higher ratio than those reach out to parents for things their students are doing incorrectly. So the positive parent communication can be one. Maybe you have a group of 15 who've been showing up consistently. You focus on that. Even those kids who are misbehaving, if they're showing up, that's something that can be a positive because we know there's a lot of students who haven't been. We talked about this in part one of giving a break during the session. So If they do the 15 minutes well, you can build in that break. So free time during the session could be an incentive. A game. If we can get through the 20 minutes of the lesson, we can get through the questions, we can take a short break, we can end the session with a game. We mentioned Kahoot in part 1. Now this one I would be a little bit more cautious on, but if you have that group of students who's doing very well, you could let them take turns, or each of them send you a link to a YouTube video. It could be musical, it could just be a funny video, something that you would like to pre-approve because you don't want to be caught off guard right in the middle of the Google Meet. But you can give them that opportunity to share. Okay, that's another incentive. Some teachers, especially 6th and 7th grade teachers, use Class Dojo in their class. So you could still use that in the online setting. Just communicate with parents, like maybe you can provide an incentive when your student gets to so many points on Class Dojo. But the students may have other ideas that we aren't thinking of. Be very good to get their input. So a gradual system of response. This is when you're using all the pre-correct, the other reinforcements, and the behavior still won't stop. There does come a time where consequences do need to be built in. And so a gradual system, just the severity kind of increases as the consequences, as the behavior continues. So you can see an example here of secondary school consequences. You can see a lot that we would use in the classroom. The question is, how do we transfer this to the online classroom? And this has been one of the most challenging things because of those limits in Google Meet. So let's take a look at some ideas. So we can start with some of those verbal redirections, like reinforcing the appropriate behaviors. We saw that with the specific praise. The reminders of the expectations. We saw that with that corrective reinforcement. The verbal warning. Okay, I've given the class reminders of the behavior, student name, please stop doing this particular behavior. There's your verbal warning. Structured choice. This is one where you give 2 options and the student chooses from this. Like if this behavior you can either continue this behavior and we'll have to meet outside of the class, or you can start following the expectations of the class like everyone else. Prompt and trust. Please, everyone, mute the microphones and then don't keep going at it, and keep with the constant verbal reminders. You give a little time for that trust to kick in. Now, these next 2, there are definite limits, but you can still build them in and say, if I mute you, just want this, it's just for 2 minutes, I'll tell you when it's done. I just want you to have this 2-minute time period just as a reminder of what are the appropriate behaviors in this setting. Where's the limits? The student can unmute themselves. That is beyond our control. So I wouldn't get into a muting battle with the student. Just the one time as a reminder, and if they insist on unmuting themselves before that and the behavior continues, move to the next thing, which in this case could be, I'm going to now, you continue to not follow the expectations, I'm going to remove you from class. Now, even though the student can re-enter, it still is another step that you've gone through to serve as that reminder. Hopefully Google Meet changes this feature where these can be controlled more easily by the teacher, but we just don't have that option right now. So, but you can still do it because it's another concrete example of the student being reminded of what their behaviors have been and how they've been unacceptable. Beyond this, if the student re-enters the class, now you're talking about if it's truly disruptive, you need to contact guardians. Maybe it's time to reach out to administration just to make them aware. You need to maybe hold that outside meeting with the students so we can talk about what's happening, why it's happening. Is there something you can work out together? If the behavior is so disruptive that class can't continue, you do have the option of ending a call. Just remember that the students can stay in that call. So you can pre-warn them, I'm going to be ending this call due to behavior. I suggest everyone end this call at this time, but that is beyond your control. If you do end a call, if you feel like you've gotten to that point, I would definitely contact administration at that point. So think about what you've been doing, and any of these, even with the limits of the muting and removing, still acts as a progression and is better than just trying to teach through the disruptions and not really knowing what steps to take. But I suggest writing out a few of these steps or some other ideas you may have, sharing them with the class, having the class help develop these, okay, if possible, and then going through these structured steps. We do know there are times where you could take all those steps, and we've seen students that just continue to escalate. So these are the students that may require that individual attention, and perhaps they would respond better in that individual setting or in a small group. This is where, I do know of a teacher, instead of meeting with all 40 kids at one time, she's broken it up into smaller groups. So maybe that helps with the behavior. You go through those reminder of the expectations, but you also use the why, the respect and responsibility, the connections to real world. If you're meeting with a boss and this happens, what would be the outcome? And even though the teacher may not have the control that a boss would in a work setting, okay, and the different similar ways to respond, you still get to that point of why you don't want it to get there in the first place, okay? Now, once again, if the behavior is chronic, it's always happening to the point where you can't teach, or you see some of the really serious behaviors, that's when you should involve guardians and administrators. So while most teachers are seeing some of these smaller disruptive behaviors, there have been some pretty serious situations teachers have been seeing. So we're going to present 3 of those and talk about some other options outside this gradual system of response. So here's scenario 1, where someone who's not even in your class comes into the setting and presents sexually inappropriate material. What could you do? So, and this, you might have even tried removing them, but they just keep reappearing, because this has happened. So I've got a little script where you could tell the class, first, I want to remind everyone this is being recorded, and I'm going to remove the person who is doing this. Then if they come back on, then you could say, if this behavior continues, I'm going to notify APS police, the sexual harassment department for the district, and school administration. They will be provided the recording so that they can investigate. The technology department could also be notified. And what you're letting them know here is that this behavior is so serious that yes, I may have limits, but there are consequences that go beyond just this classroom meet for these very serious scenarios. Now, you definitely need to contact school administrators with this. I would not contact APS police without having contacted my administrator first. Same thing with the sexual harassment, so that you can have that discussion with the administrator, make sure it rises to this level of sexual harassment before contacting the Office of Equal Opportunity Services. And you can see their information there at the bottom of the screen. But if you go through with this script and tell the student who's going to be notified, and also if it continues that you're ending this call and who's going to be notified, those are some steps you can take. Me personally, I would not stay on, if there's very sexually inappropriate material, I would not stay on that call after I've given the warnings and told them who's going to be notified. But I would also tell students you're expected to end this call now. Okay. So this is similar, but we've had some students come online with barely clothed or inappropriate clothing. So it's a little bit different. So this is where you give that reminder of the expectation of what's appropriate at school. And even though we're not on the same maybe dress code at school, there's still appropriate dress for being in a meeting with professional colleagues and your boss, or being in a school setting. There's that difference between being on a meeting with your friend and being on that meeting with this group in your class. You could go through the being removed. Then you could go through those different notifications, especially if you think it rises to the level of sexual harassment. And again, I would use the end call feature if it just continues and it's to that point where it's uncomfortable for everyone. Okay, so the response is pretty similar. I would give that reminder of the expectation first, especially if this is someone in your class. So this one we've had also arise where it's not the actual student in the class, it's things happening in the background. So if the student in the picture was doing their work, their Google Meet right there at the counter, and you can hear this argument, and maybe there's cursing, maybe there's drugs being taken, what can you do in that case? So the number one thing is just asking that student to block the camera, to mute the microphone so those outside distractions can't be immediately seen. You can also ask the student, is there another location you can take the meeting to and take the computer to? Because how we set up the environment can be a big indicator of the distractions that might be happening during the meeting, okay? So take those environmental considerations into account, and you may need to teach that to students. For example, you see the blank wall behind me. Well, it doesn't allow really people to walk behind me if that's the case. So maybe there's a way they can set that up so people can't come into screen as easy. Then you could go to the removal, the end call, if it continues, especially if you've asked them to block the camera or mute the microphone and they won't do it, and those things continue and it's very inappropriate what's going on to the point where you can't teach class or there's illegal activity taking place, then it's time to end that call, because the student's obviously not too concerned about it if they won't block the camera or mute it, or maybe they're a little intimidated by the people who are in the background. So ending the call and maybe taking that pressure off them could be another option. Once again, contact administration in those very serious cases. So to wrap this up, for some of these situations, there are some district and state resources. So you can reference this slide, that Office of Equal Opportunity Services, anything that's sexual harassment, they can help address. APS Police, if there's suspected abuse, contact CYFD. Don't forget to, as it says at the top, contact an administrator as well so they're aware of the situation. The behavior support team, we're here to help in any way we can. And if you're seeing just more basic disruptions, I mean, that's not something, you don't have to have an administrator's permission to reach out to the behavior support team. Okay, you can utilize us at any step in the process. And so here's some websites. The Employee Assistance Program. If you are worried about certain students and their emotional health, or even our own emotional health, the Employee Assistance Program has a lot of different resources, so the link is right there on that. The Teacher Leader Network Hub that's more content resources. And the Behavior Support Team, we have our own website, and you can see it marked down on there. So thank you for your time. I hope you found this helpful. Good luck with your online teaching. Have a good day.